Let's make a start. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Rebecca Bailey. I'm the Programme Director of Towards a National Collection. We're delighted to be welcoming Andrea Wallace today to talk about a culture of copyright. Some of you might have been signed up to this a few weeks ago when our other speaker got cut down by COVID on the day. So we're very grateful for Andrea to reschedule for today. And for those of you who were signed up last time to rejoin us, thank you. Thank you for sticking with us. Many of you will have probably been to other Towards National Collection events, so you'll know that as well as grant funding a number of projects at different scales across the UK, looking at how to bring collections together, how to make them accessible for research, and how to improve public engagement with collections. We also have a programme of commissioning research from particular specialists, academics, consultancies on issues that we need to know more about if we're going to make recommendations on how a future collections infrastructure could be built, sustained, used. And Andrea's work falls into that category of us commissioning her, given all her expertise in this area, the existing research that she was doing. She's done us a real blockbuster report, as I'm sure those of you who've read it. I had to edit it, so I know exactly how long it is. But it's a really, really rich source of information, both from within the UK and with reference to the rest of the world. All of our commissioned research, we give our researchers freedom to bring their expertise, their opinions, their recommendations to the picture. We don't sanitize things before they're published. So what you're getting today is what Andrea's done, discovered, and is recommending. And going forward, it's the job of the steering committee of Towards the National Collection to look at the recommendations that come from all of our commissioned research and decide which of those we're going to recommend in a policy report further down the line. So not everything Andrea says today will automatically be adopted, but it's a huge source of evidence and information for us to help consider the future. In terms of questions, you've got access to the chat, as lots of you are finding out. Please try and use the chat for kind of chat between yourselves. But if you've got questions, if you put them in the Q&A function, that'd be really good. And Javier and I will be watching the Q&A and we'll be drawing on it. Once Andrea's finished her presentation, we'll be taking questions from that and asking her to address them. If your question's particularly complicated or you're particularly keen to speak, please say so in your question. This is a Zoom webinar rather than a meeting, but it simply means that behind the scenes we can promote you to being a speaker and let you ask your question yourself. So just say if you'd like to do that, or if it's very straightforward, pop it in the Q&A. I'm just looking to my team. Have I forgotten any housekeeping? No, okay. Smashing. Then I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Andrea. She's joining us from across the pond today, I think. So thank you, and we are in your hands.
So good morning or good afternoon or evening, wherever you may be. I'm joining you today from a family member's house in Missouri, so enjoy the decor. And yes, I'm going to speak on the report called The Culture of Copyright. Again, kind of to stress what Rebecca said in her introduction. This is very much kind of a synthesizing of multiple wider questions and research that have been done to date on this question, while trying to place the UK specifically within that conversation, especially looking at all of the efforts to create a digital national collection, to think about how we can encourage user participation, both within and without institutional parameters, and even rethinking who the user could potentially be. So I thought today that I would actually talk you through the report because of the length and draw out some of the information that's maybe a bit more difficult to decipher in the data, while bringing in some of the findings throughout the conversation about the report, so that towards the end you could go back and read the analysis of the findings and maybe have a bit of a wider appreciation about how the data informed these findings. So just to begin, there we go. So again, the report, it's 136 pages. I want to highlight that there's a number of appendices that also include open data sets. And I'll highlight where those are because it's really important, in my opinion, that all of that data was made available as well for the purposes of the research and additional research that could be performed around it. So the report structure, I've mapped the presentation onto the table of contents and the main themes of the paper, starting with kind of the background to the study and to the law, and really thinking about this study and where it sits in the wider conversation, even global conversation about open GLAM, so that we understand with a wider context how the UK is positioned to engage. And also breaking down the law, both the law in the United Kingdom, because there's some disagreements around how copyright should be interpreted and impact open access, but also looking to some of our relatable peers who are really active on the open access kind of movement with respect to digital cultural heritage. Then I'm going to take you through, let's see, a discussion of the data. And the data, specifically the data sets, there were a few new data sets that came into this report. There were also some data sets that were already existing that I brought in as well. So I'll highlight where those are. And then an analysis of the findings. Sorry, there's a little bit of delay with the kind of the management of the slides. This is throwing me off a little bit, but I think I've got the hang of it by now. So really kind of thinking about the way that the findings are structured, what came through in a lot of the data is that this is really a moment where the sector needs support and support across a number of areas, not just specifically copyright, but also financial support coming off the back of COVID-19, and really thinking about without some of this support in place, what the impact of these kind of findings are going to be and the practices that are ongoing across the UK. And then lastly, there's a lot of bonus content. So the way that the report is structured is we really wanted to make sure that people would be able to find information within the very, very long document. So there's an index where you can go and you can kind of search for some of the terms or even certain institutions, but the appendices themselves either link out to open data sets that are also published on Zenodo, or they include even folders that you can download. For example, all of the images that are used in the report are CC BY, and in that folder, there's also accessible image descriptions that can be used if those images are reused in other places. So please do kind of embrace the CC BY aspect of the report so that if there's anything within there that becomes useful going forward, you're absolutely able to use those with attribution. So what I was kind of asked to do and what we were thinking about was how open access was shaping the UK's digital national collection and the ways that it can be used. And really what I wanted to focus on was the potential of the digital national collection in terms of usability, how others would be able to access and reuse the images, the knowledge, the metadata, and everything that's currently being published and generated as part of the Towards a National Collection project, but also within kind of the wider open access activity of the UK, and how open access as a movement and a concept was supporting all of this work. But there's a legal question that's central to this, which of course is related to copyright, because within collections, we have to think about copyright and how that has an impact on collections management in terms of digitizing an in-copyright work and making that available and what that level of access means, as well as the public domain content that exists within cultural institutions' walls, when that becomes digitized and whether copyrights arise. So this is a really interesting question that creates a tension when we're thinking about what open access can be and how on an individual level institutions may answer that question. Because if content is original, it's going to be protected upon its creation for an author's lifetime plus 70 years. And so that image or that digitization then will grant the rights holder a limited monopoly during the term of the copyright, and they can leverage that access to the work for fees. When the copyright expires, the work becomes part of the public domain. It can be used by anyone for any purpose. And until then, there are a number of reasons why collections may not be made available as part of open access. And something that I wanted to stress in the report is that a lot of these things are not within GLAM's control, but so often these kind of risk perceptions or the different moving pieces can actually result in an outcome that someone does claim copyright in a work that may or may not be original enough for it to be protected by a new copyright. Now, I wanted to set aside all of the stuff that cultural institutions don't have control in. And those are the in-copyright materials or the materials, that may be problematic for open access. So I really did set those aside because there's so many materials that we can focus on when we're looking about institutional practices on open access that are in the public domain. So the copyright in the underlying work isn't necessarily a consideration when we're thinking about whether or not the institution can make the work open access. And so this had a big impact on thinking about the focus and the scope of the research, because there's a huge amount and value of public domain works in the UK's outstanding cultural collections. It's immeasurable. And so for this reason, I focused on those collections, the copyright-free collections with the report. Because when we're thinking about the different policies that get created across an institution, sometimes there are blanket policies that treat public domain and copyright materials the same once they're digitized and made available online. And quite often there are commercialization desires that are deeply ingrained in decisions to claim copyright and reproduction media generated around public domain works. And some of those desires are incredibly valid, especially because they're to support the institution, to support the future digitization. But I wanted to also unpick some of those desires and maybe learn a little bit more about where they were coming from. Because so much of this is also informed by risk. And what the research showed is that so much of the decision-making around copyright can actually result in a copyright being claimed because there's risk perceived in making it available as public domain or making it available as open access. And so I'm going to highlight some of those things and how copyright is perceived to actually protect the work. So a very short background to the study and also the law. There's actually been 2 decades of research by now on copyright licensing models and open access within the context of digitization. And so this is literally a screenshot from the report. There's a lot of text here, I don't expect you to read it, but I wanted to demonstrate where some of the work has been done in different jurisdictions with respect to different questions, and how all of these studies are kind of coming together to inform this study, which builds upon it in a UK context. And I think there's some really important things to highlight from some of these that over the course of the 2 decades really hasn't changed. So we have some findings that are very specific to reproduction charging models for digital cultural heritage and the institutional drain that this can put on finances, except for a small few. And even within those few, those works and the finances being generated around a small number of very popular works. We also have some really interesting, more recent research about the benefits and the impact of open access, showing that there can be direct and indirect financial revenue generation that goes to the institution because of a decision to go open access. So this understanding that maybe there's a trade-off between exclusivity and the ability to commercialize assets with open access and who can commercialize assets is a bit of a false mutual exclusive category, because we can really see that open access provides commercialization opportunities that may not have existed without an open policy. And so in thinking about some of this and how to develop the different evidence sets and what I did in terms of methodology, because we're looking at how can we think about this in the UK context, I wanted to position the UK against some global data. So I used an existing spreadsheet, which I'll tell you about in a moment. I also created 3 different data sets of new UK data. So one is a sample of UK institutions looking at wider digital collections and rights management. And I included all of the instances and the institutions that are already open and have open practices within that to kind of compare those policies with some of the ones that have more traditional and restrictive policies. And then from those, I also drew out a selection of 63 institutions that I went deeper into online policies and open access, kind of examining how they interpreted copyright, as well as conducting 31-hour open-ended interviews with Tink investigators, UK GLAM staff, open access advocates, and external platform staff. And then, of course, case law and policy developments, discussions about the UK, and again, the relatable peers, as well as some of the literature review, which I just mentioned. So this is the Open GLAM survey, which I mentioned, and it's work that I've been doing with Douglas McCarthy since 2018. It's ongoing. And in terms of a survey, we take a user-focused approach to looking at institutions' policies and extracting the data that we collect ourselves within this. It gives it a bit of a quality control purpose, because we're able to look at the policies and interpret copyright against those to come up with some of the coding that's in the document. But the data that's used for the report is as of the 7th of October. And at that time, there are 1,208 recorded instances in 49 countries with over 70 million open assets. As of today, there's now 1,431 in 54 countries with 85 million assets. So you can see even within 6 months, there's significant change in the global landscape. And I think that's really important to keep in mind as we think about the pace at which we move within our own institutions and even across a national sector. We also have a new UK, GLAM data set, which is an additional data set that I created of 195 institutions. I looked at, on the right-hand side, you can find on page 14, the various data points that I pulled out related to entry fee, the location, whether or not they were eligible for UKRI or AHRC funding, different ways that open access and digital collections were framed or presented on the website, whether or not they engaged with Art UK and other types of external platforms, and so on. And so there's some really rich data in here as well that can be sorted, and that was used, of course, to create a lot of the different findings about the data throughout the document. And then lastly, when we look at how this is organized across the sector, it's really interesting to kind of compare what the global landscape of Open GLAM is compared to the UK landscape. So that the number on the very left is global instances. So it's what everyone in the world is doing across galleries, libraries, archives, museums, universities, and then this category of other. And then we have the UK instances next to it, which somewhat correlate to the activity on a global level. And then the UK GLAM sample, I tried to really build out and think about both open and more traditional policies around copyright. So you can go in and you can look at the distribution organized by sector, as well as it organized proportions. And so this is to kind of help everyone who may be within a specific sector look a little bit deeper into what their sector is doing as well. And then the new UK GLAM data on 63 policies. So I actually removed information from every website or platform or cultural institution that was selected for the deeper dive into policies might engage. And I listed those in a table. So you can go in and you can actually look at the copyright and open access policies across multiple platforms by the 63 institutions. I also collected ethical policies because we're seeing some shifts and movements looking at the problematic metadata or even images that are made available online. So these data sets are actually really rich resources for institutions if they're thinking about looking to what other institutions are doing with their policies as well. So here we come to the legal question that really kind of centers the report. What the question is that we're thinking about here is whether the materials that are generated during reproduction are sufficiently original to attract a new copyright. And in the EU and the US, this is increasingly a no. And this is because there's more solid doctrines and legislative activity that are really trying to push the idea that things in the public domain should remain in the public domain upon digitization. But if we look at the UK, while there hasn't been recent case law or even legislative activity, the UK's been a bit busy with Brexit and other kind of legislative tensions. The Intellectual Property Office, however, has stated in a copyright notice published in 2014 that according to established case law, the courts have said that copyright can only subsist in subject matter that is original in the sense it's the author's own intellectual creation. And of course, this is a reference to the EU standard. However, there's been discussion within the EU that this standard maps on to the UK standard of, I'm blanking for a minute. But there's an alignment of case law within the UK and the EU on this question. And so what they're saying here is that given this criterion, it seems unlikely that what is merely a retouched digitized image of an older work can be considered as original. And this is because there's minimal scope for a creator to exercise free and creative choices if their aim is simply to make a faithful reproduction of the existing work. So if we're looking to the skill, labor, and judgment that might arise during the reproduction of a work, which is the UK standard, and we try to map that onto the EU standard, there's some interesting questions about how that aligns and how these different things should be informing institutional policies. But how does this translate to practice? So in terms of what the coding for the data looks at and how open is used, there is so much variation across different institutions that it was really important that I adopt a definition myself by which I could kind of measure the different activity. And so I aligned that definition with international definitions that are used in the Bethesda, the Budapest, the Berlin, the Open Knowledge Foundation, and even Open Access Scholarly Publishing, where the international definition requires that materials that are published under open access are made available for commercial use. Now, those then would encompass materials that are published online as public domain, CC0, which is a public domain dedication, CC BY with the Creative Commons license for attribution, CC BY SA, which is attribution share alike, or certain equivalents. But there's something that's really important to remember here. And that's in order to apply a license, any license, whether it's Creative Commons license or something else, like the UK's open government license, there must be a copyright that exists. So that material must be original in order to apply a license. And if it's not, upon the moment of creation, it actually exists as a public domain work. So this is where there's also a bit of a tension in the interpretation, because an institution might desire to apply a CC BY license, but really that's a statement, it's a legal statement saying we have copyright in this and you must attribute us. It's a legal obligation that follows that license. But that legal obligation isn't enforceable if the copyright doesn't exist. So this is an interesting kind of area and even a bit of a compromise that some institutions have been thinking about when they do want to make their works available for commercial use, but they're looking at the CC BY license as actually being a compromise and a bit of a consolidation in terms of making sure that people are citing the institution and citing the source artist along with the work. So how does all of this translate into reality? Well, so far we've only talked about copyright, but really there's a lot more going on here that informs decisions around copyright. So copyright itself is often the primary question that we're asking because we also have to question whether or not the underlying work is in copyright in order to make it available as open access. But there may be other rights that protect the work or exist in the work, regardless of whether that artist is UK or the work even was made in another jurisdiction, that an institution wants to honor and take into account. And some of those are moral rights that the country of origin might recognize in the work and with the artist. But we also have a really interesting kind of fluid understanding of what the public domain is. And this is really demonstrated among interviews and also in looking deeper at some of the institutional policies that are online and what they say the public domain is. Because there's a lot more content that's in the public domain that is being represented by institutions. And there's also a different understanding of what the public domain is with respect to all the reproduction media that's being generated. And this really came through in some of the discussions in the interviews. But we also have, contracts that can limit what institutions are able to do. If the donor or a third-party photographer, even a commercial partnership, has bound the institution by contract to respect certain restrictions, that binds the institution. It may not bind users because they're not party to the contract, but that's an interesting thing to consider as well. And then there's obligations for public bodies. There may be positive obligations to publish data or even publish according to what the funder requires an institution to do, as well as questions around privacy and data protection with respect to some of the analog metadata that may be written around a work or around a document, as well as the metadata that gets embedded in the work as well. And so all of these things kind of get compounded to really create what one participant said, a road between commercialization and free that's really difficult to walk morally, politically, and legally due to the gray areas around whether rights in reproduction media can be claimed. And there's also layers of these rights and uncertainties that can compound. And what I mean by that is when we think about the work of art or the cultural object, and then how we photograph that or scan it, or it's included on an archival mount with other information, and even that becomes scanned, when there's a copyright that's presented alongside the work itself, it actually may be something within the work, a component of the work that needs to be communicated as rights protected. But because there can be technological questions and issues around presenting that information online to the user, a more restrictive approach can be taken. So all of these things really compound the issue of how institutions interpret and also present copyright information to the public. Okay, so now I want to turn to the data and think about digging in a little bit deeper. Because what's really interesting about the data, I think, is how the UK compares to the global sector and how quite often there's some inverse relationships going on. So first, a few things to kind of refresh a memory in terms of what data I collected and how I coded it and how it informs what we're about to discuss. I looked at open access to digital surrogates of public domain works. Okay, so of course we set aside all the copyright and protected works, and we only looked at what public domain collections were doing in online spaces. I then followed the UK Intellectual Property Office's position that says no new rights exist in faithful reproduction media. So the way that I kind of discuss these things a bit differently is framing them as either public domain compliant assets. So those are assets that align with the UK IPO's office, the position, or open compliant assets. So new copyright claim with commercial use permitted. And of course, that's because there's a copyright claimed because commercial use is permitted. It does align with open definitions. And then there's actually a couple of approaches that institutions can take. So some institutions release all eligible data. So this would be all the reproduction media generated around public domain works as a matter of policy. So it's a policy decision by that institution that public domain work should remain in the public domain upon digitization. But we'll see that the majority of institutions release some eligible data, and this is a matter of practice. So this may be related to funding obligations. It may be related to restrictions internally, especially around collection management systems and how information can be published as public domain, even leading the institution to publish on an external platform. So we see a lot of practice-based open access, not as much policy-based open access. And I want you to also remember that this data is a baseline discussion. So it's an at least approach to kind of quantifying the digital collections and open access engagement, because there's a number of ways that some of this information may be inaccurate. It's based on what the institution presents online, but also how an external platform sometimes mediates and filters the user's engagement. Because again, it took a user kind of based approach to collecting the data and understanding how a user would see and understand what information is published open access. And then just as an aside, when I say instance, I'm going to refer to an institution. So, cultural institution, galleries, libraries, archives, museums. Volume means amount. So these are the number of assets or the volume that an institution might publish. And it's worth noting that in the UK, there are actually 8 institutions that release 1 image in total. And this was a really interesting finding that I'd like to look into a little bit deeper with respect to those institutions to understand if those organizations just have 1 image in their collection that's eligible to be published to the public domain. But this was a really interesting finding. So how does the UK compare to the rest of the world? Well, you'll see that on a global scale, a lot of open access activity is occurring in places that are more financially able to explore the question, may have concentrations of cultural heritage and cultural heritage from some of the countries that are lesser represented, but also because there are a lot of activity among data aggregators in these areas. So specifically Japan, New Zealand, Australia, we're looking at Europeana and also Art UK, in Europe, as well as the Digital Public Library of America in the US. And these are some, some explanations for why this information may be concentrated in certain places, because it makes it really easy for people to be able to access clusters of open data and reuse it. So this is something to keep in mind when we're thinking about what the UK might do going forward. But we see that the UK actually ties for third among the top 10 countries with Sweden, after the US and Germany. And in total, the UK has contributed more than 10 million open and public domain assets. So this is 14.8 of the global total volume. But within this, 7 were identified as contributing 99.3 of these assets. And I have those 7 on the next slide. The majority, so 73 or 91.3, approach Open GLAM as exceptions to policies that claim rights and commercialize assets. So the 7 instances that were identified as contributing 99.3 of all assets are the National History Museum, British Library, Portable Antiquities Scheme, Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, Wellcome Collection, York Museums Trust, and Royal Pavilion and Museums Trust, Brighton and Cove. And of course, you'll see in the second column, the volume of assets. And these 7 range from contributing a volume of more than 7 million to 28,000. So this is a huge range when we're thinking about like where this 99.3% is weighted, especially because what I wasn't able to do is to see if maybe there was some overlap in assets between some of the institutions. So for example, the National History Museum publishes on their website and Europeana. And naturally, there could be some overlap in these assets, but I wasn't able to check that. But you'll also see that some institutions like York Museums Trust and Royal Pavilion, Brighton and Cove, they actually publish as a matter of policy all of their data under public domain and open compliant policies and through their own website and Art UK or Sketchfab. So they're experimenting with multiple platforms depending on the type of data and ways that they can interact with and reach different individuals. But then across all of these, I noticed a huge difference also in quality. And I wasn't able to dig deeper into this question, but some of the institutions that make their works available in higher resolution are the Natural History Museum, the British Library, some images within the Wellcome Collection, and this is more of a data legacy issue, and also Royal Pavilion Museums Trust, Brighton and Cove. Some other institutions clarified that they were able to maybe release things in lower resolution because those are the types of internal images that existed for a work at that moment. And so it was their understanding that it was just best to publish them openly, while they create new photography behind the scenes at higher resolution based on requests. So there's different approaches that are being taken across these institutions as well. And when we look at the open access scope of UK GLAM instances compared to the rest of the world, we see some really interesting data around the kind of some versus all eligible practice or policy question is approached. And so you'll see that mostly around the world, we have, an approach where institutions are engaging on a practice-based kind of level. They're releasing certain collections, or they're thinking about this creatively with different kind of collaborations with external platforms. In the UK, it kind of resembles the same. So we have an even higher rate of institutions that are looking at some eligible data. And then when we look at the distribution of open licenses and public domain tools, so of course, these are the licenses that claim copyright but still released for commercial use versus the public domain tools. I really tried to break down what different countries were doing. And so we can see that in the United States, it's mostly public domain compliant in terms of how institutions are engaging, regardless of whether it's on a collections basis or it's a matter of policy. But you can see that really dark blue color is actually the representation of institutions among those that engage that do accept the public domain should remain in the public domain principle. So we have the United States and France and even Spain really leading on that. While the United Kingdom, Germany, and the Netherlands do engage on more of a practice-based approach with open licenses. And so there's another way to kind of present this information so you can see that spread in proportions. But I'd really encourage you to go look at the appendix, because I take a much deeper dive in the appendix with each of these 10 countries, looking at the primary platforms, the leading institutions that publish data volume, and thinking about which licenses or public domain tools are used the most within those jurisdictions, and even whether there's any jurisdictional kind of legal or legislative insight that promotes these types of policies and creates some stability in these jurisdictions. And there is a bit of a correlation between a stronger answer to the legal question versus more of a variety in terms of how institutions engage and not having a clear legal answer on the question of copyright. And then when we look at open data volume in the rest of the world compared to the UK, within the UK, of course, we have more than 10 million assets that are open and public domain compliant. The majority of these are open compliant, so they're protected by an alleged copyright with different legal obligations around attribution or sharing alike that might attach. But when we look at the public domain compliant assets, the British Library makes up the majority of these dedications to the public domain. And then all the rest of the UK assets are actually about 10% of this number. So it's just over 100,000 assets that the rest of the institutions in the UK have published public domain. Another data point that I collected that felt really important was whether museums and galleries are charging for entry because of the obligations in the UK that may come with grant and aid requirements, or that may come with different legislative obligations to make entry free. And so there's a perception that a lot of institutions that do have open access policies are able to do that because they can supplement that income that they may have lost through licensing with ticket fees. But the data shows that that's just not the case. So we have actually 68 institutions around the world, museums and galleries, that provide free on-site access in addition to free online access and open access as a matter of policy. And then lastly, just looking a bit deeper into the UK data and the 195 organizations, we do have UK GLAMs that publish all eligible data as a matter of policy. So there's 6 of those. But again, the majority approach open access as an exception. And I identified 50 instances in the UK that publish fewer than 100 open assets. So that's a big portion of our 80. We still have GLAMs that are maintaining technical protection measures in various ways on their website around image download and reuse. And I found instances of some UK GLAMs actually removing assets from the websites and open access platforms to bolster exclusivity. So this is something to keep in mind, because even when we look at the representative percentage of UK Open GLAM instances, that's vanishingly small because it's all known instances compared to the entire UK sector of galleries, libraries, archives, and museums publishing collections online. And these are the 6 instances that align with the UK IPO notice. I'd like to highlight that the Royal Pavilion Museum's Brighton and Cove policy actually references the UK IPO's interpretation of copyright law in their policy. And publishing occurs across, again, a number of platforms. But what was really interesting is that the large majority of UK Open GLAM instances are actually local and regional organizations that are publishing via these external platforms and aggregators. And instead, the UK's largest holders of culture collections are not open, and they primarily publish restricted collections on their own websites. So Art UK hosts the highest rate of open instances in the UK, about 47 or 58.8% of where data is published. So to just highlight some of the findings, which you can find in section 5, and I would encourage you to go back and read that now that maybe you can understand some of the data a little bit better. What we really see is that copyright licensing is not a viable revenue scheme, and this is based off of the information from the interviews, but also 2 decades of information that says it's just not something that's going to be reliable even going forward, as more institutions embrace open access and markets shift to use open data. Also, the overwhelming majority of UK GLAM policies don't comply with the UK IPO's interpretation of copyright law. And the large majority of Open GLAM instances, again, are these smaller institutions that are using external platforms. I also found instances of staff regularly turning to open collections and data that was made available by relatable peers. So this was a really interesting finding. Rather than turning to their collections, they actually went online to Wikipedia or institutional websites that they knew had high resolution images and open policies. And that really the UK GLAM sector is starting to fall behind in comparison to the rest of the global scheme. Where open access has been embraced by institutions in the UK, there's been an overwhelmingly positive impact, and there's a number of examples of this in the findings. But we really do see a risk of decline or stagnation because some staff right now are having to redefend those policies. And as a result of all of the risk and all the uncertainty, participants really welcomed a stance by TANK and the UKRI and even other institutions that would give them something to argue to the decision makers and people who are kind of thinking about whether open access is right for the institution, especially because some staff noted that where those policies weren't embraced by larger organizations, it was easier for their open access work to kind of be marginalized or relegated to anecdotal evidence. And then within TANK projects specifically, which is what I really wanted to set out to understand, I learned that copyright has already impacted a number of the projects and the Digital National Collection because decisions on data quality and rights management are being taken by each GLAM and included in contractual agreements that are being signed by everyone. So there hasn't been a group-wide discussion around what type of data will be published other than really metadata. So again, I'm really interested in the images, and the value of the images is kind of the entry step. And there are some instances of specific metadata being made available, but even that metadata is being released at a lower quality than what the institutions may have on hand because of the desire to commercialize the more enriched metadata. We're also seeing that, what the result is of some of the projects which are bringing together all of these collections within restrictive platforms that are not going to permit public reuse beyond the platform, is that public reuse and the research will occur through those curated narratives, the algorithms and selection processes that have informed the digital collections and TANK projects. So just to briefly conclude so that we can get some questions, there's risk aversion that's unnecessarily holding back the risk or the heritage sector. But there's also a conflation of copyright with commercialization goals is occurring because there's a lot of decisions being made based on potential commercial viability rather than actual commercial viability. Something that we saw with a lot of the open access GLAMs is that exclusivity is not necessary to commercialize assets. So you can have it both ways. You can publish openly and you can continue to work with Richmond images, and you can continue to work with private corporations and commercialization opportunities. And so I'm just going to quickly close out with the recommendations. The recommendations, again, which are my own, is that there was a huge desire for people from interview participants that a position was taken on copyright and open licensing because it would reduce the amount of work being done internally to advocate for this. And so we could do this on two levels. One is to endorse the UK intellectual property copyright notice so that the legal question has a defendable position, but then also through an open licensing requirement for future infrastructure outputs, because any such requirement is not going to impact all the grant funding that was currently awarded, which is why the legal position is also really helpful. But then to develop a program for long-term public domain copyright and open access support, because a lot of the participants stressed that open access is just as difficult, if not more, than managing kind of the in-copyright and the licensing that goes on a day-to-day basis, because there are new questions, because there's so much labor and expertise required around that. And so part of that is thinking about how we can expand access, especially towards passive community support, supporting future infrastructure and a program for open access support to really centralize in one place, maybe where that support is coming from, and improving the messaging around open access to draw out those really rich examples that push people over the edge when they're thinking about their future policies. But again, to also think about new research on future-proofing open access, because there's a benefit of the UK actually being a bit behind in terms of UK sector-wide embracing open access. And that's that a lot of people are just at kind of the precipice in the forefront of this question. So because there's a little bit of a blank slate, we can think creatively about future-proofing policies that enable UK GLAMs to avoid some of the questions that the leaders in the sector have been experiencing around legacy data, around policies changing, and rights-related issues stemming from open access. The UK does have a lot of really rich data on the benefits of open access to think about how to design steps forward so that the institutions that haven't participated yet can have more of a future-proofed way forward. So what this would mean in practice is that, any IPO copyright notice alignment that anyone might take up is a voluntary alignment. And it would only apply to existing digital surrogates and data of public domain collections where the GLAM claims and holds those rights. A new open licensing requirement, which of course would align with the National Lottery Heritage Fund requirement, would then make sure that future funded projects by the public are able to access the data that's produced through those. And then the impact on in-copyright materials and collections, just to kind of resolve anyone's worries, are none. If the underlying work is in copyright, the image itself cannot be made available for open access for commercial use. So with that, I'm just going to close out and answer any questions. And again, I see some in the Q&A, but if you'd like to kind of pop in and answer or ask a question directly, please do.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I hope everyone is feeling intellectually enriched this afternoon as I am. If you haven't read the report yet, get a big mug of coffee like Andrea's got there, a comfy sofa, a good few hours, and dive in. But thank you so much for giving us the highlights. You seem to have a bit of a posse going on in the audience because they're answering some of the questions for you. So we'll try and pick out. We've got one, before you take your screen down, Andrea, we've got a request to put the recommendations back up. Can we go back to that slide? Okay, let's just leave them there just now. Okay, we've got a few things in the Q&A and a few things in the chat, but as I say, some of the stuff in the chat, you've got other people answering for you, so that's very helpful. Sorry, I haven't had a chance to read them all. Have you? Do you want to pick out any ones in particular?
Yeah, so one of the questions from, well, C. Taylor, let me know if you want to speak as well. But for example, one of the questions is that, well, first, should they charge? So, I mean, I will read the question. So the research library, we have just started to collect both digital scans of originals to protect the original from use and born digital items, such as PDFs, from online to preserve for the future. We would like to provide both of these public access. So we charge for access of our materials. There's a follow-up question by the same person. And so we found copyright for, we found copyright for research unclear. So should they charge for copyright? So probably, well, in this case, for research in specific, or should they charge for copyright? I'd say that would be me expanding a bit.
Okay, so to kind of, I'll answer a portion of that, which is directly relevant to the report. And I may set aside the underlying kind of copyright questions. But part of what I think is being conflated in our discussions is the question of access and digital access and ability to view versus open access and ability to reuse. And so this is a really important distinction to keep in mind, because when we talk about open access, the content itself should be reusable for commercial purposes. So I think what you're potentially asking here is a question about providing public access or digital access in general, in which case that would be okay. But if you're charging for access to that material, then the platform itself would not be open access either. However, if the question is to make it available for reuse, you do have to think about the underlying copyright questions and whether those exist. And I know that there's been some other funded research around some of these questions. Maybe Rebecca or someone could drop some links to those in the chat.
Okay, thank you. The HES lawyer, Susan, my colleague, has a question here. She's following everything that you're saying in terms of how it relates to digital copies of material in which the original copyright has expired. But she's asking, what about collections where the original copyright protection is still in force, and was that out of scope?
So yes, Susan, that was out of scope for this study because there are so many reasons why the copyright in the underlying material may exist, may be protected, information may be unknown, we may have orphan works, they can be unpublished. So I set those aside because quite often the institution may not even have time to do copyright clearance conclusively on some of those things. And I focused on the things where there were clear answers. We knew that this content was in the public domain and it could be made available without these concerns. So it's still an interesting and important question to consider, but that really does hinge on the access versus open access kind of spectrum. Information, that content can be made available for digital access with the proper copyright kind of restrictions around it. It can't be made available for reuse, open access, commercial purposes.
Great, thank you. We've got a very short question in the chat from Tina Warner. She'd like to hear your definition of commercialization.
So this is a kind of an existential question that can change from one jurisdiction to the next. So whether something is a commercial use may depend on the copyright legislation of a country. And within the UK, we have something that's called fair dealing. Now, I'm going to set that aside because in theory, if there's no copyright in this work, then the media itself can be made available for any purpose, right? But quite often what institutions are doing is they want to make sure that commercial organizations aren't free riding on the fruit of their labors, the digitization, these sorts of things. So they claim the copyright and maybe use a non-commercial license like CC BY and C. And what that ends up doing is creating additional parameters for public users and their ability to determine whether or not their reuse of that content, even though the underlying work is in the public domain, is compliant. So it really is just a distinction in terms of how the license itself kind of is categorized. I didn't adopt a definition for this. I just followed that used by Creative Commons.
Right, and we've got a question from, sorry if I pronounce this wrong, Nelly Gabriels, on how do you choose between public domain mark and CC0?
So this is another interesting kind of philosophical question too, because like historically, and when I say historically, I mean like over the past decade, the understanding has been that the public domain mark has been preferred to apply to media when the underlying work itself is so long in the public domain that there's no question to it. But that then doesn't answer the question of the digital surrogate and whether rights arise in that. So there's been a shift in recent years, and especially following the Met's adoption of the Metropolitan Museum of Art of CC0 for their open access collections, because what CC0 does is it's a public domain dedication that in the text includes what's called a fallback license. So it tells users in any area of the world, even if there are rights in this media that we're publishing, we're dedicating it to the public domain so you can rest assured that we're never going to enforce our rights against you. So the CC0 can be a better tool to use because it creates user certainty for users in those jurisdictions where they may be a little bit uncertain about whether or not they can or cannot use works.
Okay, and Douglas has posted a link for that in the chat.
Yeah.
We got a question about database rights. So did the research include, oh, it's disappeared off my screen. Did it include data available online in databases where the organization has database rights?
So the scope and kind of the entry point really did start with digital surrogates of public domain images, and where there was also being, data made available, metadata, data licenses, those were recorded as well. Database rights are certainly important, especially when we're thinking about the user and how they access the data within the database, including an image as data. So that is discussed very briefly in the section about the law and how those things compound to create a lot of uncertainty, but the report doesn't focus on it in and of itself. Can I just, I see a really important question in here that I'd like to kind of draw out if that's okay, Rebecca.
Yeah, go for it.
So Rosie Blackmore says there's really significant costs in creating the digital assets, archiving, storing, and maintaining the systems. If all national assets become open access, how are you suggesting that these costs are covered? And I think this is a really important question that needs more data in order to think through this. Because in terms of digitizing and tracking the labor and even costing how much a project requires of an institution, we may not have a lot of data on that in order to make arguments at a policy or governmental level that institutions really have a digital mission that they have to fulfill and they're expected increasingly to fulfill, especially falling off of COVID-19 and all the new engagement that's happening in online spaces. But we need to be able to go back to policymakers and government to say, here's what it's costing. And we need to start offsetting those costs with real funding in order to allow institutions to fulfill their 21st century missions. And I think this is really important because what the data shows is that the cost of maintaining a licensing system is an additional part of those costs. And it doesn't necessarily, for the majority of institutions, offset the cost of digitizing and storing and all of that. So I think this is a really important point and would love to think creatively, about how maybe some data can be generated around that to enable new policy making.
Thank you. Going back up the chat a bit, I've got Ellen Van Kier asking, is it okay in view of the CC license terms to offer low resolution images in open access, but retain high resolution images for commercialization?
So this is also an important question. And in terms of CC0, the CC0 applies to the asset, and we're thinking about user certainty. So if you apply a CC0 public domain dedication tool to a low resolution image, in theory, it also applies to the high resolution image because it's just a copy of that image. It's a copy of that data at a lower resolution. The resolution itself doesn't impact the question of copyright or public domain, but it doesn't, here we have that tension between first, what is lower resolution, but making things available CC0 and then charging service fees and additional types of fees under a different model. So not a copyright model that looks at commercializing the asset, but even keeping back the higher resolution images for those types of agreements and arrangement, but charging service fees for them. And there's an ability to even manage what people are able to do with downstream reuse through the contract that's provided through the service. So not that I'm advocating for this approach, but it's legal and it's legitimate. And that's another, I think, interesting way that even lowers the barriers to access to higher resolution images while communicating and passing the cost off to the user of providing that service. It just looks very different from a copyright licensing fee, which can sometimes be in hundreds or even thousands of pounds.
Great, thank you, Andrea. We seem to have a beautifully behaved audience because we're 1 minute to go and I think we've answered all the questions. Oh, wait a minute, a new one has appeared. My colleague Andrea at National Museum Scotland, she's saying, do we need a discussion of a sector-wide agreed equivalent of royalties or other business models, recognizing the background work that has gone into preserving the work?
So in terms of royalties, again, this is potentially a copyright model system and resolution. But I do fully agree with the fact that the user needs to understand the cost of managing the digital collection, creating the digital collection and providing it to the public. And so again, maybe service fees or even donation-based models. In the past, I've seen some really interesting models that allow users to donate prior to download, and it really makes transparent some of the costs around that. And I would be really interested to see what sort of open access revenue streams and business models could flow from making decisions to publish things to the public domain. Because Effie Capsulis has written a really wonderful report that's referenced in the Situating the Study section that goes into more detail about the brand licensing revenue opportunities, the way that funds were freed up and able to be reallocated. And there's even some discussion in the analysis of findings around institutions that realized where their hangups were and what was creating unnecessary costs for the institution after they went open access. And it was without making that decision that they never would have known where some of those pressure points were that were draining funds. So I think there's some internal trade-off around costs, but there's also some interesting ways to think about new future business models and ways that the UK can generate revenue around the provision of images that don't rely on copyright.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Javier, just checking, I haven't missed any questions, have I? I think we've got them all.
Yeah, not from the panel, but yeah, there's still a few on the chat.
Questions that haven't been answered?
Yeah, from the chat. Let me just find. There was one about costs. So the disconnect between open access research and open access collections. So did you found any disconnections between those approaches? So the question is, yeah, so did they have any different approaches, and was there an indication of what they will be between open access collection for research and open access in collections as in commercial?
Well, if I understand this correctly, we're thinking about, especially against the backdrop of some of the tanked projects, the collections themselves having rights restrictions, but being integrated into a data aggregator or a platform that allows the public and even the commercial public to search and do things within that platform. So the platform itself is open access because there's no fee. You could compare it to ancestry.com, where you have to have an account, you have to pay, I don't know, an annual fee in order to access the content that's in there. This content is made available through the platform, and the platform itself is open access. And I do discuss this a little bit further in the section on the analysis of findings, because what we do see is that this is kind of the UK understanding and approach to what access means, which is more of a scholarly publishing approach. And the big kind of difference between that approach, where the platform is open access, is that the underlying content, so the papers and the data and the things that are being published through that, do have copyright protection in them. But when we think about making collections available online, where it's a faithful reproduction of a public domain work and other sort of non-original reproduction media, like descriptive metadata, paradata, things like this, that may not be protected by copyright in the first place. So to take an open access approach is really just a digital access approach, because you're providing digital access to content that might otherwise be protected or restricted. If I didn't understand that question correctly, please feel free to clarify in the chat or ask a follow-up. But that's how I would have interpreted against some of the findings in the report.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrea. I can see that participants are starting to head off to other meetings. So I think we've answered everything we got. So thank you so much for such an incredibly useful presentation, and particularly incredibly useful piece of research that's generated a lot of debate, discussion and thinking, which is exactly what we wanted when we asked you to do it. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming, and yeah, we hope it gave you all food for thought. So many thanks.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks so much. And you can also follow up directly by email.